Hello everyone, it's Khadija and Nabi again. And before I start today, I want to begin with a question that challenges how we normally see the world. So, when we think about the East, are we really thinking about reality or are we thinking about an image that's been shaped and repeated over time? And that's exactly what I want to focus on today. I'm going to explore how the West constructs the East through representation and power based on Edward Said's Orientalism. Now, to understand this, we first need to stop thinking of representation as just description and instead see it as something that actually produces meaning. So, Said's main argument here is that the East is not something we simply observe in a neutral or scientific way. Instead, it is produced through representation. Now, the important point here is that representation is not passive, okay? It doesn't just reflect reality like a mirror, it actively shapes what reality is understood to be. And that's why Said here says the Orient was almost a European invention. Okay? So, what does that mean? Okay, what he means here is that the idea of the East, as we understand it today, has been largely formed through Western texts and imagination, not through direct or neutral experience. So the Orient is not something that exists fully before language, it is something that gets constructed through repeated ways of talking about it. Okay. Now, once we understand representation as something that produces meaning, we can start to see how a fixed image of the East is actually built over time. So on this slide here, Said argues that the Orient is not an inert fact in nature. This means that the East is not naturally fixed or naturally the way it is often described. Instead, it is constructed through repetition, through the same ideas appearing again and again in different texts and contexts. So, for example, here we have the East is often described as exotic, mysterious, timeless, or unchanging. And now the key issue is not one description. Nope, it is repetition. Because when the same ideas are repeated across literature, history, and media, they stop being seen as opinions and start being seen as, I can say, like common sense. So over time, this repetition creates the illusion that the East has a stable, fixed identity, even though that identity is being reduced. Okay, but this construction doesn't just create an image of the East, it also creates a relationship between East and West. So this idea here leads to one of Said's most important ideas, which is the creation of the other. Now, the West constructs itself as rational, modern, and developed. But that identity only becomes stable when it is contrasted with something else. And of course, that something else here is the East. So, the East here is positioned as irrational, emotional, backward, or less developed. So, this is not a natural or objective difference, it is a relational construction produced through representation. And yeah, even writers like Fluppert, I don't know if I'm sorry if I'm saying the names wrong because I never really heard them, I just read them. So yeah. So we have this writer, Fluppert, who played a role in reinforcing this by describing the East through imagination and stereotype rather than direct reality. So the East becomes the other, not just different, but necessary for the West to define itself and maintain a sense of superiority. And yeah, this raises a deeper problem. How do these constructed images become so accepted that they start to feel like truth? Okay, so Said explains this through repetition and authority. So when the same representations appear across literature, academia, and media, they become extremely um, difficult to question. At that point, they stop functioning as, interpretations and start functioning as knowledge, mere knowledge. And this is important because knowledge about the East is not produced equally. As I've mentioned, it is produced from positions of authority, such as institutions and academic systems. So, what we call truth about the East is actually the result of repeated representation and combined, um, you know, repeated representation combined with power and authority. So, in this sense, truth is not something neutral or discovered, it is something constructed and stabilized over time until it feels natural. So, once representation becomes accepted as truth, it becomes closely tied to authority and power. Okay, this is where Said's argument here becomes more critical and theoretical. He is influenced by Michel Foucault, who argues that, knowledge and power cannot be separated. Said here describes Orientalism not as individual opinions, but as a system of knowledge production involving scholars, institutions, and even cultural authority. And this system does two things at the same time. It produces knowledge about the East, and it produces authority over it. So whoever actually defines the East also gains the power to control how it is understood, classified, and even governed. And most importantly, this authority is never neutral. It always reflects historic and political context. So representation is not just about understanding the world, it becomes a way of organizing and controlling it. And this relationship between knowledge and power doesn't stay in theory, it continues to shape how the world is represented today. So, why this matters? Okay, even though Said here is writing in a specific historical moment, his ideas are still very relevant today. So we still see similar patterns today in media and political discourse, where entire regions are reduced to simplified or stereotypical images. These representations matter. Why? Because they don't just describe people, they influence how people are perceived and even treated. That's why Said's work pushes us to question representation itself and ask who is producing these images and what interests are behind them. It also reminds us that knowledge is never fully objective, it is always shaped within power structures. So, yeah, to conclude, Said's Orientalism shows that the East is not simply described by the West, it is actively constructed through representation. And these representations do not just reflect reality, they shape and produce it. And because knowledge is connected to power, these representations also help maintain systems of dominance and inequality. So, what Said ultimately challenges us to do is rethink representation, not as something neutral, but as something that shapes how we understand the world, which which brings us back to the question we started with: are we really seeing reality or just a version of it that has been constructed for us? So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.